Hi everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Kevin Schroder and we will talk about microfrontends today. Just to show of hands, how many people have used microfrontend in the past? Well, it's not that little. More than I expected, to be honest. Yeah, we will talk about it. Are they actually a scalability savior? Do they help you, your enterprise to scale your front-end development, or are they an unmanageable maze where your developers are just left frustrated in the end? Um, I'm Kevin Schröder. I'm a lead software engineer at Deutsche Telekom, mainly in the full stack area. I'm with the company since 2017 for some time now and live in Germany, Aachen, the most western city of Germany, right at the Belgian and Dutch border. And besides doing full stack engineering, I have a very big interest in machine learning, process mining, and data science. Short note about the scale of the enterprise we are talking about. Telecom, my employer, is the largest European telecommunication company. If you're from Europe, you probably know us. If you're from the United States, you probably know T-Mobile US, our subsidiary. We are active in over 50 countries with around 200,000 employees with mobile and landline connections for our customers. So we are quite large, and as a large company, we have a lot of front ends. We have a lot of front ends facing our customers. We have a lot of front ends facing our internal employees for our internal processes. If we start a web project, we usually start like this. You probably also do. You select some basic framework you want to develop in. I just pictured the big three. I don't really have a big favorite anymore. I was a Vue fanboy, but to be honest, I just pick what my team wants to do. You select some design system. You probably have one from your company you want to use, or you use some of the standard MUI, Tailwind, Bootstrap, whatever you want. And you select your tooling you need. Do you need some charting libraries? Do you need some Gantt charts? Do you need some store, routing, whatever you want? And then you build your application. And the neat part is, if you have really thought about the first two parts, you have some building blocks to work with. You have a recommended setup. You probably know how to build scalable Angular applications. You write nice components, and then you can really scale with your team your front-end development. And afterwards, also deployment is fairly simple. If you do these very standard web projects, in the end you just get static resources out of it. You deploy it to some web server and serve it to your customers. Could, for example, look like this. You take your Vue application and put some Tailwind on it, build your actual application, and deploy it to Nginx on some Kubernetes cluster. You don't really care. It's just static resources, fairly easy to share. But sometimes in large corporation, something annoying happens. Other people want to build stuff in your front ends. Very annoying, because I don't want people touching my garbage projects. Even if it's enterprise code, I think enterprise code is not always the nicest code to write or read. So in the end, we can't be cute opossums and trash bags. We have to scale, and then the question is, how do we do that? We have some tool to our weaponry through the frameworks we're using. We can use components. We can give them some space in our project where they can work. But sometimes you have the issue that the incoming team writes in a different framework, and they are really uncomfortable with, for example, using Vue.js. They might make a lot of changes in your front-end code, and you constantly have to navigate their changes, have to navigate their merge requests and stuff like that. It can be quite annoying. But usually, if it's a small amount of teams, it still works. But what happens if you do it with a larger number of teams? It really gets frustrating. Microfrontends offer one alternative to this. And now let's just start with the basic of microfrontends and look at my personal website. It's fairly simple. It just has some information about me and some pictures, and that's it. But microfrontends now would say this is not one application. This could be many applications. So for example, it's just like cutting components. I have a component for the header. It is actually that case. It's just written in React, my personal website. A header, the picture wheel, and some info section. 3 parts of my application, and even if I do standard React, I would cut them into different components, write them independently. Separation of concerns in the front end, very simple. Microfrontends go the next step. Microfrontends say, well, the header is one application, The picture wheel is one application, info section is one application. Now, if I'm really, really bored in my free time, I could actually write them in different frameworks in microfrontends. I could say the header is very simple. I just use some basic Vue.js. It's one component probably. The picture wheel, I have some nice React library I want to use, so I use React there. And the info section is Angular because maybe I have some design framework that does these tabs very nicely with Angular. So I use that one. And then I have some aggregate microfrontend that aggregate application that aggregates these sub applications into one. And the neat thing is, if I do this, if I do microfrontends, is I can basically select a framework for each feature I want to write. I can select the tooling for each feature. Maybe some parts of my application require complex routing, so I can use Vue router or whatever I want. Maybe I need some store mechanisms, so I can use Pinia, Vuex, or whatever. I can build my applications independently, and that is really interesting because maybe I want to make changes to my info section, but I don't want to build my whole application, so I can only rebuild my info section. And I can also deploy parts of my microfrontends independently. How does it look like in practice? I have a very small toy example, which looks like this, not as fancy as my personal website. And on this website are 3 microfrontends. You have a microfrontend, which is just the header. You have a microfrontend, which is this left side of the application, which has some routing through Vue router. And I have some list functionality here that is using Pinia as a store. And if you look at the code, this is the repository I put it in, and you basically have 4 applications here. And let's start with the root application, which is basically the container where I load all my microfrontends in. If we look in the index.ejs, I make it bigger for you to see. This is written with single SPA, which is one of the most popular microfrontend frameworks, as I know. And it uses system.js to load in the different applications. So I have here a line for the header, and it has the URL where I can get the code for the header. If we go on there, it's just the build from the Webpack dev build, which you can access here. The right side of the application, the left side of the application. You can see when I wrote this demo, I was very keen on doing good naming, left and right, amazing application names. But basically, it just tells my application where it should get its microfrontends from. And if you look at the network tab, this is exactly what happens. We query 3 app.js's from these different local hosts. One is being the header, one being the left side, and one being the right side. Now, if we want to, for example, change one microfrontend, let's say we have this nice list here, but sometimes we want to have a clear all button. Who would have thought? I already prepared this. We can implement our clear all button. The white application just rebuild 10.18.07. That should be right about now. Now, if we ramp the application, we now have a clear all button. And the neat thing is, I only had to rebuild this right side of the application. I only rebuilt this Vue application. I didn't have to touch the other applications. They were just aggregated from the root application together. This is the baseline how microfrontends work, what they offer from a technological standpoint. You have different tooling you can use to implement microfrontends. You have Webpack Module Federation, which is out of the box working very, very great if you only do one framework, if you only do Vue.js, only React, but you want to have this independent builds, you want to have the possibility to build them, to write them independently. You have single SPA, which is, I think, the de facto standard for a lot of people doing microfrontends because it's with the oldest open source package out there. And you have several open source and commercial products building on either Webpack Federation or single SPA or someone self-written where you can do microfrontends as well. My personal history with microfrontends is pretty long already. I started doing microfrontends in 2018 with my first project. Since then, they didn't really leave me. I worked or consulted on 7 projects internally now using or considering microfrontends. and supported the single SPI core team with like community-driven and website support, and did some minor contribution to the Vue packages. And in general, I have to say, the technology is really lovely. I love it. It's really cool. I remember first time playing around with Airbnb Hypernova. It's a cool thing to have like different application, having them built independently and then still aggregate into one cohesive application. But I'm very critical of its application. It's gotten kind of a trend. It's just a Google Trends line of microfrontends, and with the Magenta Sparks is where I started new projects with microfrontends or consulted on them. And it kind of became a trend that every new front end, every rewrite needed to be microfrontends. I was like, no, please do monolithic front ends if you don't have the scale. And yeah, the question is, why do people think microfrontends are so great? And one of the main arguments is, the main selling points is that microfrontends really enable in domain-driven end-to-end ownership. So if I have, for example, a contract team, and I have some contract APIs that they own, and now they also should develop a front end. In theory, they would have to go to the application that you want to build the contract UI in and put it in there. But with microfrontends, you can develop your own microfrontend. You just have to put it into the root application and it will place it somewhere on the UI. And then you have true end-to-end ownership, and the contract team can really own its whole stack from the APIs through the backend to the from the backend through the APIs to the actual front end. They can develop it full stack there. And that's one of the main promises made by microfrontends, not only by developers, but also a lot by consultants and architects. The next one, which is already selling into the first point, are these fast independent builds. Of course, if you do smaller application, if you do microfrontends, your single microfrontend will build way faster. You can build it independently and you can deploy it independently if you want to. Another argument often used is reusability of microfrontends. Hey, I write one UI once and then I can ship it to different UIs if I want to, so I can reuse them and kind of build my own enterprise app store. Next one, they are framework agnostic. I already showed it you a little bit. You can use Vue.js, you can use Angular, React in theory together. And scalability, not only from a technological side, but very importantly from an organizational side. You can parallelize your front-end development way more. So now the question is, microfrontends are such a trend. Do these actually hold true in practice? And this is what the remaining part of the talk will be about. How does it really look like in practice? Do these promises actually hold true? And just to get you how psyched your developers will be, if you introduce microfrontends, we have Bob on the bottom right, and he will basically tell you the mood of your developer when you tap into these mistakes. Let's start again. Again, end-to-end ownership, the main selling point. And it already starts with a big question. How do you really cut your microfrontends effectively? Because that is a really hard task to do in enterprises, because just saying, well, I have a contract team, they should build the contract application and also the front end, so they basically build then a contract search, could work if you just do it domain-driven, but what you will run into is that microfrontends are not truly independent. It's not like a microservice where you just have interfaces. You will have to interact way more with other UI components. For example, in a diagnostics UI, if I search for a customer for a contract, I might also want to see his network inventory. What is actually on the line from backbone to the actual router. So I need its inventory. So already I might have an inventory team and a contract team that have to work together, even though the promise was, hey, we have independent microfrontends, I can develop them independently. Yeah, no software is actually that independent. You still have these dependencies between projects. Of course, there are solutions. There are, for example, event buses you can use shared libraries or shared store infrastructure. But then the next question comes, who owns this common infrastructure? Event buses, for example, are then basically put into the root application that grows in size. You can send some events on the event bus, and other microfrontends can listen to these events and react accordingly. But yeah, you have some friction there. People still have to talk to more about each other. They have to maintain this things. And it becomes a real problem in expert systems, Because in expert systems, big parts of the application often interact with each other. And saying, well, microfrontends will reduce the friction between teams probably isn't true then. The worst thing is you go out of these frameworks, you go out of Vue.js, Angular, whatever, where you have a correct way to do things and how to make components communicate with each other, and you go to this unbeaten path of microfrontends where you have some ideas how you can work together, but it's more what you make happen, and there's no right way to do things. However, there are applications where it works really great, and that are portal-like applications. So basically, the project I'm working on at the moment is our field service UI. So basically, where do our technicians actually run around and dig holes and put fiberglass in them? And we just have a collection of things that can be useful to technicians. So they have a contract UI, they have an invoice UI, and a disposition UI, which I'm working on, obviously. And they can open them on this portal, and we have no shared infrastructure out of the user logs in, and we propagate the user login to the microfrontends, and else they're completely worked on independently. They have little friction. We need little communication. We have no shared infrastructure. Then it works really, really great. For example, AWS portal is, I don't have it on complete authority, but there's a highly suspicion that they also use microfrontends to make it happen, because you don't need the EC2 UI to communicate with the S3 UI that much. Next promise, fast independent builds and deployments. And that is true. I just showed it to you. I can build my Vue application independently from the rest of my application and then theoretically deploy it somewhere, and it would update without me having to rebuild all the other microfrontends or the root application. But there are some issues, and that's basically the shared infrastructure you build around your microfrontends. You will probably share a design system, else your microfrontend will look like a mosaic and will not look like a coherent application. The problem is if you use funny things like web components, they cannot be registered twice. So if one team decides, well, we need the new features from the new version, and you try to upgrade, basically what web components will say, well, I've already been registered, the second version will not register, and one of the microfrontends will break. So if you use shared infrastructure, you will run into issues if you use certain applications that cannot be registered twice, or also very simple, you're sharing the same browser. So if you, for example, use CSS variables or CSS in general, if you use the same naming, for example, ID app, that's happened multiple times in multiple projects, that some microfrontend said, well, we just use for CSS sharp ID, and it will collide with other projects in ways you cannot really foresee. So again, updated service requires changes in all, specifically when you're talking about the design system. Also, you need some kind of mature DevOps processes behind it, because you really don't want to rebuild, for example, the root application every time you change your microfrontends, but else you will run into hashing into caching issues, and you also need some kind of discovery and registration of microfrontends built into your DevOps processes. If you start microfrontends, invest in those, else it will be a pain later down the road. Next promise, reusability. This is something I advertised a lot in the past. Actually, this slide is from a single SPA webinar in 2022, where I basically told like people attending the webinar what we at Telecom thought microfrontends would be, and we just built our nice standardized European APIs based on TMF. And then said, well, based on these APIs, we will just use microfrontends and ship it to all kinds of applications, and it will be great, and we will have some app store, and if we try to build new applications, we just take what's already there. In reality, in theory, that's possible, completely possible. In reality, it looked like this, because it really didn't hold true. We made some mistakes on our own. For example, we didn't really define a common interface for microfrontends, what kind of shared services will always be there, what kind of information is passed towards the microfrontends. But also, you build coherent applications with a certain user experience, with some accessibility in mind. And when you put one micro frontend that you build, for example, for an expert system for technicians into an expert systems for salespeople, it will look horrible, and it also won't help the user, because the example diagnostic system and sales system, salesperson doesn't know what some numbers in some table about the landline connection mean. They maybe can understand a signal light, red, green, yellow, but it's really hard to make it happen that you build for one application and ship to another one. It will look horrible, and yeah. For portal applications, however, it works fine because you only interact with a single page on the portal. What really worked with us on a long run is integration of BI tools through iframes. This is basically Microfrontend slide. This is something we do a lot, where we just take BI tool charts or some tables and we put it through iframes into our other applications, so we don't have to code them natively. Again, that really works. But in general, reusability of microfrontends, enterprise app store, that is something a lot of consultants are running around, and I really haven't seen it work in multiple projects. Framework agnostic. Yeah, you can combine Vue.js, Angular, and React together. That will work. Do you really want to do that? You build an application, and then your application is done, and you have 20 microfrontends with different frameworks. And if you then scale down development and only have one single maintenance team, they have to maintain all the different frameworks, which might be hard, and B, all these frameworks need to be loaded into the browser. It's already a pain to ship 3 different versions of Vue.js. It's a bigger pain if you ship 5 different versions of Angular, 2 of React, and 2 of Vue.js. It just drops your performance down. I know for internal applications this is often not the case, not that big of a problem, but if it really scales, it will be a problem. However, this framework agnostic way of doing things can be really useful for migration projects. So if you have a legacy front end and you want to move it to a new tech stack, you can start with your old Angular 1 application, for example, as a root application, and then churn away on it, basically replacing large parts of the application with microfrontends, and in the end, you just replace your old AngularJS container with a very lean root application, and then you have your new front end on the new stack. Another point is, well, you put in a new dependency, and this dependency is specifically to the technology you use for microfrontends, what you use to aggregate them. And I have to say, Webpack Merger Federation is quite healthy at the moment. Single SPA, for example, is not quite healthy. I know Joel, who mainly build micro front ends and single SPA on his own, is a cool dude, but he's severely under pressure because it's way too little development time he can put into single SPA. There are lots of bugs in the ecosystem at the moment, and I foresee the same for a lot of smaller open source projects and also commercial products where the people will just lose interest in maintaining it on a long term. Scalability. From a technical side, well, you can scale microfrontends quite nicely if you have the requirement. You probably will have rarely the requirement that you actually have to scale static resources. But when I first started with microfrontends, I just asked my backend DevOps guys, hey, can you build me a pipeline for my microfrontends? And they said, sure. I just take 3 Nginx containers and then put them into our Kubernetes cluster with the microfrontend application. And we ended up basically with a Kubernetes cluster with 20 Nginx running in there, which just served a few kilobytes of data. Just use one central web server. If you really need scalability, you can build them into different containers, but usually you will not need that. It just creates operational overhead. And also makes it harder to handle registration of microfrontends. So basically, if you deploy to one source and you use a common pipeline definition, you can already take care of registration and placement of microfrontends and also updating of microfrontends through caching a little bit better. It's in the end just static resources we're talking about. Then we come to scalability through organizational. and in the organization, and that is really where microfrontends shine. This is the main argument besides this end-to-end ownership. If you have lots and lots of teams and they need to work in parallel and they have really great separations between the microfrontends, they have to communicate very little with each other. Microfrontends are great because the teams can really work on them independently. They can use their own tech stack, they use their own tooling without interacting with other people too much. It starts getting a problem once you introduce new dependencies, and you will do that very, very fast if you cut badly, if you don't really have a front end that is suitable for micro front end. It's because components are communicating with each other so much, and if you don't introduce some governance for ownership. This really can kill your micro front end project, but it can still work. If you really have to scale because you have 9 teams working on one UI, with certain governance, it can still work, but it might be a big challenge for your organization. Where it absolutely doesn't work, if the micro front ends are in the end owned by very little teams. I have seen teams with only 7 people that said micro front ends are currently so cool, we want to introduce them to our front end, and basically they owned as a single team 20 micro front ends. It's not feasible. It doesn't make any sense to say, well, managing this project, it's hard. The solution is to just create more projects to manage. It will just kill your productivity. This also comes when you say, well, I want to apply the Chinese principle. During development time of my application, I will have 10 teams that build in parallel micro front ends, but in the maintenance phase, I will just have 1 team managing it all. This 1 team will not be able to have an overview over the whole application because it's all separated so much, and you also create a lot of duplicated baseline code and stuff like that. The team will not have an overview. If you do micro front ends, plan long term. Will I have a project that is maintained by multiple teams on a long term, or do I just want to apply the Chinese principle? Then don't do micro front ends, do a monolithic UI. You will have friction, but you will have it in both ways anyways. And that's already basically it. So some takeaways for you. Things that make Bob happy. If you use microfrontends in large organizations, and I really mean large, this is why I put the small information about my employer in there. Microfrontends can really work great if you have clear ownership boundaries, e.g. portal applications. I made some advertisements for them here already. You have to invest in a little bit of DevOps and automation. For your DevOps engineer, it might be boring, but you as a front-end engineer probably have to give them the ideas because you know better how front ends work. You should keep micro front ends really as independent as possible and really be careful when deciding the scope of one micro front end. And I can guarantee you will make a lot of mistakes when starting this off. You will probably cut micro front ends too small, make them not independent, make them communicate with other components too much. And you may also have the issue that you might be cutting too large and then end up with a micro front end which has just one micro front end. It's just a monolithic application. You should really document and align your shared systems. This was a mistake we did very early on, where we said, well, we want this enterprise app store. In the end, we probably never wanted it, but we didn't have a common interface, define a common interface there, really look at the governments, what are the shared systems, who maintains these shared systems, and plan long-term. Microfrontend are a long-term investment. It's not something you get on board for a short-term development boost where you just say, I have to scale in like a few months, I do microfrontends now, and later one team can maintain this mess. It's a long-term investment if you have strategic projects where you need this scalability on an organizational side. Things that make Bob and your developers unhappy. If you force-fit microfrontends to small teams or simpler apps, over-engineering is never fun. This is the same thing that we constantly talk about microservices. How many conference talks have you heard already where people basically hate on their microservice architecture because it's too complicated for them? Well, you over-engineered your backend. You can also over-engineer your front end with microfrontends. The overuse of shared state and libraries can really kick you in the back, because in the end you're building again a monolithic UI. You just ignored a lot of best practices and ways of doing things from other front-end frameworks and put them into your own responsibility where you don't really know how to do the governance for them. Shared state and shared libraries, you will use them, but you should use them sparingly as possible. And also don't assume framework agnostic comes for free. You will pay for it in performance by side loading different libraries. You will pay for it with your organization that always has to keep people on staff that are trained on this frameworks. And yeah, that's basically it. In the end, the really thing I want to hit home, and this is something a lot of people in reality don't understand yet. Microfrontends are only an organizational scalability tool. They are not there to solve technical issues. There is no technical issues you can tell me that microfrontends solve. Out of some very, very specific things, I know some people that do, for example, 3D rendering, they might need it, but otherwise it's an organizational scalability tool. You want to move fast with your whole organization for a strategic project, not for some pet projects. And that's it. Thank you very much. And yeah, open for any questions you have. Okay, are there any common challenges when using microfrontends with server-side rendering? Me personally, I have never actually used server-side rendering for microfrontends that much. Back when I experimented with Hypernova of Airbnb, it's completely server-side rendered based. There are some issues. I know from the community Slack of single SBR, but cannot tell them to you at the moment. I'm sorry. Is it possible to implement immutable cache, and how can it be managed from the root application? Yes, you can basically implement everything you want in the root application. If we look at the root application, as I showed it you before, it was just a very lean HTML application. But in theory, you can make your root application as complicated as you want. For example, if you have a migration project, you might start off with your existing Angular. In my example, we had one project where we started off with an existing Angular 1 project. And you can basically build everything you want in this Angular 1 project and then pass down objects down to your microfrontends through an interface. So you can implement immutable caches or like actual store infrastructure inside your root application, just pass it down through any interface you want. Does it make sense to use microfrontends to prove modularity and in turn resilience and testability? Modularity, no, not really in my opinion. It's a tool to, well, it depends how you define it. If you define it in I want to have microfrontends to make my teams independent, have a modularity there, then it works. But microfrontends are not like components in the way that if you cut your front end just by components, you will have lots and lots of dependencies between them. If you cut by microfrontends, you really want a component to be completely independent, and that is not rarely the case in modern web applications. However, can we go back? I wasn't done. Or I can just. Testability is a very interesting thing, because that is something we invested some time in at Telecom, because it's really interesting. Most frameworks for like a single SBA have the possibility to run in a standalone mode, because you can sideload microfrontends anywhere, also on an empty HTML application. And then you can really test your microfrontend independently from all the other applications and increase testability through that, because you can create way more side effects if you want to in a more granular state. Can code base size be a reason to split into several microfrontends? Yeah, faster builds, of course. If it's really a problem for you, it can help. However, you have to see that microfrontends need to be shipped, in theory, need to be shipped with the framework attached. So if you write 5 microfrontends on Vue.js, you can through, for example, Webpack externals, sideload one view version. But if one microfrontend decides, hey, I want to migrate to the next version, and the other three are not migrated yet, you have to ship view twice. So yeah, code size can then be smaller, the build code size, but in the end, if you maintain different version of the same framework, you will increase your size again. Next one. Microfrontend mobile app, hybrid, native, web-based. What is your opinion on this idea? I don't think it's a good idea at all, to be honest. I haven't done a lot with microfrontends to build them in mobile apps. We have had the situation in some edge cases, basically where we had some very, very complicated diagnostics, which we ship to our apps for the field service guys. And there we didn't really use microfrontends as in technology that really aggregates things and sideloads frameworks and stuff like that. We just use web components because in that case we can also put them in some native or web-based mobile app, and we can also put them into our main applications. For this we can whether use iframes, web components. These tools are out there already. They are not a scalability tool like microfrontends. That is my opinion on this. Next one. Or are we done already? I think we're done then. Thank you very much.